to hear it. So please make sure you time in yourselves, time other speakers, so you're giving the POIs an appropriate time. Please make sure that you both offer and accept POIs at least one per speaker. Unless there are any questions, then without any further ado, I would like to welcome the Prime Minister.
Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so before we go into our case, let's do a bit of housekeeping and a bit of like explanation before that. So what do we consider the full circumstances? So what we think is that we're talking about what is the full truth of what is happening and what are the full like surroundings of what is happening. We don't think that that necessarily includes parents sharing like super gory details. So like 2 examples. So in the case of like a divorce, a parent would probably share that they're having a divorce because, I don't know, for example, my dad cheated on me, but they're probably not going to share like, you know, like which positions and who exactly that was. On opposition side, however, we might have a definition that would be more like we're breaking up because we don't love each other that much anymore, or something that is kind of like toned down and kind of like more palatable. And then another example with like cancer, you would probably share with your kid that a relative is actually dying from a deadly disease. You would probably not go into like super gory details in the sense of, you know, they're going to be like in so much incredible pain and there's this cancer eating its way through the lungs. So you're not going to actively try to traumatize your kid. But I think that is very much common sense. So why do we think that this is something that will benefit kids and will also benefit parents? So when parents are in a situation where they have to deal with a personal tragedy, that puts immense stress onto them, right? If you're going through divorce, if you're going through bankruptcy, you're going to feel really, really bad about yourself all of the time. And you cannot keep up appearances to the point that your child does not realize that this is happening. So what you're going to do is that you're going to snap at your child. You're going to be tired more than you usually were. You're going to have less patience for your kid. You're going to have less ability to communicate with your kids because you're under so much emotional pressure yourself. Now, why do we think that this is a bad thing? Because children are super sensitive to how the adults around them are acting, and they're super sensitive to how, you know, especially how their parents are feeling. Like if my parents are having a bad day, even if they're trying to hide it, and even if they're saying, well, they're just feeling a little down, it's nothing serious, if that continues over several weeks, and note that most of these personal tragedies are things that don't just, you know, are done and dealt with in a few days, but they're things that keep on going for several weeks at least, usually. So a child is going to be notice that very significantly. Why is that so bad? Because when children are presented with a change in behavior in their parents and they don't have an adequate explanation for that, the first thing that they're going to do is that they're going to blame themselves. Why is that? Because even if my parents tell me like I'm going through a divorce right now and because of that I'm not feeling that well, but it's not, you know, it's not that bad, because we're trying to shelter our children from the full truth and we're trying to shelter them from like the gravity of what is happening, that makes it very likely that children are going to assume, well, since it's not that awful, but they're still acting like something really, really bad is happening, then how, you know, then has to be something else going on. And that means that children will deliberately try to kind of take themselves back. So that means that children will maybe blame themselves because they think that it's something they have done. But even if they don't do that, they will try to be like super over accommodating. And that means that children who are going through a traumatic event themselves will probably not feel comfortable asking for any kind of emotional support. Yes, I'm going to take CO.
Look, you need to engage with the instances where you have a parents that pass off. And if children are sensitive, it's probably going to be worse off on government the minute that you expose children to these bad news.
Okay, so if a parent passes away, there's no real way that I can shelter that, like, period. Like if the parent dies, then they're just gone. But what you have on your side is that the child doesn't learn about what exactly happened. Can you imagine how painful it must be for a child if their parent just like dies and no one tells them exactly what happened, exactly what went wrong, exactly why they passed on? Like, how does this work for like the process of getting closure in any grievance process if you don't have information on that? So what else? Why else is this a bad thing? So if we want to respect children as people who are able to deal with traumatic news, we're giving them the option to actively be engaged in the grievance process and in the process of coping with like personal tragedies, because children can feel and deal with a lot more than we give them credit for. And if we respect children's capabilities by disclosing the full circumstances, we're showing them not only that their feelings are valid and that they're allowed to ask questions, but we're also showing them that there's no shame in being sad about certain things. It shows them that there's less shame in, like, for example, going bankrupt, that there's no shame in going through a divorce, so they don't have to rely on like messages that they're getting from like media surroundings and their peers for that. You can actively communicate with your child, and say, yes, we're going bankrupt and we don't have any assets right now, but that is not that, you know, that is pretty awful, but that is something that will pass, and you give your child the option to work through with that with you. So where do we stand with that? On government side, you do have the burden to accept that children will probably be more uncomfortable in the short run because they'll be faced with like more damaging news in a shorter amount of time. However, what we're giving them is an option to work with that through parents and to not have to go through that process alone. On opposition side, you do have children that are more sheltered because they're being exposed to these news in like a more controlled setting. But what you also have is you have always a certain lack of deceit on opposition side, because you're never telling them what exactly is happening. And that results in the thing that children will maybe blame themselves if they feel like their parents are too unwell for which news they've heard. But it also means that they're probably going to find out the full circumstances later on, right? So depending on whether the parents ever see fit to disclose the full circumstances with them or not, they were probably going to find out through, you know, like other relatives, through going through any family documents later on after the parents have passed. It's very hard to keep things like bankruptcy and divorce under conceal forever. And that means that as a child, I will feel like my parents have betrayed me, that in a situation where I would have wanted desperately to know what was going on with them, where I would have desperately wanted to maybe even help them if it's an older kid, or where I would have desperately needed someone to actually take the time and talk to me and really share the truth of what is going on, no one was there, which means that I'm as an older kid or as an adult are going to feel defeated by my parents. And that is juxtaposed by the momentarily more discomfort that I have on our side of the house, but I'm not feeling defeated, and I feel like I can have clear communication with my parents. Children's feeling are legitimized and have a higher chance of being dealt with adequately because we're not keeping them kind of like under like lock. And on opposition, you have a loss of trust because those things will be declared eventually. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech, and I would like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Please PI in the chat. In the case if I don't take one by 5:30, you can unmute yourself and ask by voice, because I can sometimes become overly engaged in the speech. So really asking you to remind me if I get lost. 1 second to turn on my timer, and I will be ready to start. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. Please recognize that childhood is an extremely important phase for developing of your emotional coping mechanism and the mindsets and the emotional strategies that you develop, that you adopt for the rest of your life, and changing which requires a lot of effort. Therefore, it's critical that you have healthy development of your coping mechanism and possibility to deal with stress and anxiety, which undermine by exposing children to huge amount of stress from the very beginning. So we are speaking for a more gradual development of children, and we will explain why they most likely aren't able to handle this properly because of very biological reasons. Before that, let's engage with the opening government on two things. Firstly, on firstly, on the fact that children are going to blame themselves because they still perceive their parents as angry. We believe this is a very mechanistic thing that can be solved simply by the way in which you frame. So you can explain when you are on average more angry and more upset, even without explaining what the full extent to the problem situation. So you may be angry at so the child won't feel whether the child doesn't know how much you should be upset due to the divorce. So likely the mere explanation of having a divorce would be enough explanation of the anxiety and parent being sad without even added explanation of the cheating happening. So you just by providing reasonable explanation, you can probably work out through so that the child doesn't blame himself. It's a very mechanistic issue that can be solved by the way in which you portray it. Secondly, let's engage with the impact on the future relationship with child discovers in the future. We have three responses here. Firstly, notice that some kind of circumstances in the future will disappear and therefore will become less relevant and carry less emotional weight, such as bankruptcy, for example, which will become less relevant in the future. And therefore, if you find out that if like 5 years ago there was a bankruptcy from which the family recovered, it doesn't matter that much now. Secondly, notice that in the future you still may be able to have a normal discussion with your child and explain it properly at the point at which the child is more able to carry the news. So it rather depends on whether the family at all is functional. If the family is functional and you have good relationship with children, you probably will be able to do a proper explanation. If the family is dysfunctional, that you won't that we agree that there probably it will be an additional factor of doing children blaming their parents, but probably you already inside dysfunctional families have lots of problems anyway, and therefore the relative impact of this news on the bad relationship between parents and children is not going to be huge. So therefore, the way whether the relationship survive depends on whether the relationship are strong in the first place, and it doesn't have strong impact. And thirdly, notice that in future children are likely to be able to understand it as well. For example, they may have their own children and therefore understand the position of their parents better and be able to reflect on it, or simply have a broader picture of the world, see how other adults do it and understand it as normal, so as a social norm, see their, for example, younger brothers, sisters they want to protect, and therefore understand the position of their parents. So likely this problem will be solved. Before we proceed now to the meat of our case, please closing. Opening. Anybody?
Right.
Okay.
So if the kids are going to find out anyway, especially in the public, why then do you still think that a simple explanation, writing it off, would be enough for them?
They will find out full circumstances later, at the point at which they are more developed and therefore more able to understand the situation properly, and it's less likely to induce the amount of anxiety it would have involved at the point that which you're going through this difficult situation, making this difficult situation even worse. So it's beneficial that you find out later when the situation has ended. Now let's proceed to our cat. We have to firstly independent on developing the long-term anxiety. Notice that you preserve this so-called the higher level of serenity of childhood, because in childhood everybody perceives as a point when you don't care about anything, you are fully happy and you don't care about the future, don't have an anxiety about, for example, your family trampling due to the financial problems. And it's important to preserve this at least some extent to this childhood serenity because of two reasons. Firstly, this is a unique benefit which you won't experience at any other point of life, because always in the future you will have problems that you need to deal with. So it's important that you have at least some point when you don't have this and you can fully experience this bless and grace. Secondly, it has also a long-term importance for people in two respects. Firstly, you can at hard times in your future you can lean on the happy memories of the past, and therefore you can much more able to deal with future stress, because you can lean on those happy memories and good feelings. Secondly, you can train yourself in your future to develop better coping mechanism and stress managers when you lean on those good memories, because the way in which you develop possibility to experience some kinds of emotions is by invoking memories of the situations when you experience those emotions. Therefore, you strengthen the neural relationship of experiencing those emotions. Therefore, having a point in your life and strong memories in the past of having strong positive emotions is beneficial for you to have the ability to invoke those emotions in the future and to develop this as more standard ways of which you're feeling. Therefore, this is important for your having a happy childhood or a not very unhappy childhood is very good for your long-term psychological health. Now, the last point to discuss is is why children, if you tell them all the situation from the very beginning, are more likely to develop anxiety and negative mindset for the rest of their lives. So firstly, let's discuss why children have weaker coping mechanism and are unable to handle the news properly. There are 3 reasons for that. Firstly, reducing anxiety requires conscious management of your emotions. It requires stopping the ruminations. It requires stopping your anxiety and shifting your attention from bad aspects to good aspects. Children simply don't have the prefrontal cortex developed to the extent which allows them to do this conscious management of their emotions and shifting from their anxiety. Second, it requires adopting complex views and understanding complex situations. For example, understanding the fact that somebody can commit the bad thing but still be not a bad person, and stuff like that. And these concepts can often be hard to understand because children often have simplistic views and require certain amount of experience and possibility to handle different, often paradoxical views at the same time, and therefore they are less likely to have a black and white understanding of situations. For example, only blame one of the parents for the cheating and therefore be more angry with them. And third problem is that parents often cannot provide sufficient consolation and due explanation to the children to have to handle the situation because parents are often not gods in terms of the level of emotional intelligence. So the impact that you get of that is that children are more likely to develop the long-term anxiety. Firstly, because the development of coping mechanisms against stress requires gradual exposure. Now you get sudden exposure to huge amount of stress and you are not able to develop the coping mechanism. And secondly, you're more likely to develop mental models and mindsets that world is bad, world is dangerous, you need to not trust to people, you need to always rely only on yourself and protect against other things, and it has many adverse consequences of your life, therefore how to oppose.
I think the leader of for fan speech, and I would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
All right. Yes, good. All right. Please put your POIs in the chat, and I will start in 3, 2, 1 now. All right. First, let me answer some of the issues raised by the opening opposition. Well, first to the stress point, and that telling them is just going to put such a huge strain on them. Like the PM has already explained to you, the full circumstances means that we think that they are still going to give a child-proof version of it. So in case of death or any disaster, these events are going to be put into terms that the child will understand. So a less explicit version is chosen, and the problem and the issue is going to be presented in a way that is digestible for a child. We think that parents have just a vested interest into making sure that their child is happy and safe. So when they choose, and which they should do, choose to tell them the truth of the full events that happened here, we think they're going to do that in a way that is most beneficial to the child. Now, we completely agree with opening opposition that childhood is an important developmental phase, and that you do learn coping mechanisms for emotional stress in your childhood. The thing is that the healthy coping mechanism that you should be taking away from your childhood is that healthy communication and open communication is what is going to get you through an emotional stress situation. And we think that you learn that if parents from an early age start being fully honest with you about why something that affects your life or why your life is affected in the way that it is because of what has happened. Because the disaster will influence the life of the child, no matter whether you tell them or not tell them. Like if you're going to be bankrupt, suddenly, you're going to have less nice stuff probably. And if your parent sadly passes away, well, you have one less parent. So it obviously influences the life of the child. So the positive emotions case that opening opposition says that, well, if you don't tell them, you have more positive emotions. We don't think that is true. We think that the positive emotions are being reduced by the disaster, not by whether you tell the children about the disaster. The question is whether children get to know why suddenly maybe there are less reasons to be happy, why suddenly their mother isn't there or they have less nice things. And we think that if you start engaging in an open conversation with them, then they get to understand that and won't start blaming themselves because, suddenly, I don't know, I am less happy. Why is that? So this is when they start having a negative view and a negative perception of the world, and not when you start telling them what is going on. Because we think that children get to ask questions once you tell them what happened. They get to engage in conversations with their parents about it. And we think that positively affects self-perception and also how they engage with their parents and their social circle. Once they learn that, this is not a taboo topic, this is not something you need to be feel shameful about it, we think that that is a positive effect because then they can talk to their peers about it. We think that that means that social isolation in their social circle is less likely to happen because, you know, they will also not only from talking to their parents with it, this will mean that they are also more likely and more comfortable talking about these topics with their peers, more comfortable answering questions, more comfortable engaging conversation with peers. So children with similar bad events, which, you know, bankruptcy and single parent households is not something that is super uncommon, but the children with these similar experiences in their past, they are now also more likely to talk with each other about it. Now, in turn, we think that this also positively influences how children deal with this bad news. They are going to start to perceive it as something that is just part of life and not just something that the world is super unfair to them and this happens to nobody else, just me. I am the victim that is of this super horrible event and no, everybody else is living the dream life. No, they see, okay, this is a part of life and they will learn to, you know, deal with this in a healthy way. Also, then when these children talk to each other, they can give each other advice or recommendations on how to deal with it. And this is probably very helpful advice because it is coming from peers who are in the literal same situation as you are. So the general impact is thus that they aren't ashamed about the circumstances that they're in, which means that the disaster affects the ability of the child to be happy very much less than if they didn't know what was going on. So because they don't feel shame about it, so shame is not putting a damper on their happiness. The second thing is, you know, they're better able to deal with potential traumatic events now through conversations with parents and peers, but also later in life because now they have learned how to communicate sensitive topics, that it is important to address things and not just let things simmer and things like get you're horrible and stuff. So we think that the debate in general is going to come down to whether and on what side of the house you have more psychological damage and better coping mechanisms. And now let me tell you why on upside specifically, you are much more likely to cause damage and like raise a child that has unhealthy coping mechanisms. Before I get to that, a question from closing opposition or opening opposition.
Yeah, even in your absolute best case, you're absolutely incorrect because in
specific disasters that affect your child's happiness, your own happiness as this child, it is important to address them. Like you don't need to start talking about bullying with your parents when, I don't know, you're bankrupt now. Like if they understand what is the specific cause of their unhappiness or of their reduced happiness, we think that is where you one person you can relate to more, and therefore you have a better sort of way of communicating because you're living it right now than some theoretical bad thing and practice on something that you currently have no relation to. So now, why is it on upside you are much more likely to cause some emotional damage? Well, of course you can tell a lie or false version of the actual events. The problem is, one, no lie will fit so perfectly that it just perfectly explains all the reduces in happiness or all the reactions of all your surroundings. Nothing is going to fit that so perfectly that one lie will just cover it and then no questions will be asked. The child will wonder, this story doesn't make sense, or like, I mean, it works for this one particular thing, but maybe it won't work for another. The second thing is, this child is not going to be in an isolated relationship with their parents where they never talk to anybody else. Once you start telling a lie as a parent, you can't just get the whole world in on that lie. You can't just tell everybody in the city, okay, this is the group memo on what specifics we have discussed with our child and how everybody is supposed to act and pretend that something is fine or not fine. So we think that in the case where you start telling a lie, you are very, very likely to be found out by the child. So either you're found out by the child and they think, what, okay, I can't trust my parents. Apparently this is something we shouldn't talk about. Apparently I'm support. They learn that it's okay to stuff down your feelings if you feel like you're protecting a loved one. We think that all these things are unhealthy coping mechanisms because you're stuffing down your feelings. You don't talk about them, which means you get frustrated at a certain point of time. You maybe start villainizing the world. And even if it isn't found out, even if the child believes your lie and just some things doesn't make sense, there's still this general feeling of distrust towards your parents. You lose the chance of teaching your child that open communication is a key part of life. And we think that is what makes government wins debate and why opening up a government is going to take this. Thank you.
I thank the DPM for a fine speech, and I would like to welcome the deputy leader of the opposition.
Hello, am I audible, yeah?
Yes, you are.
Pure West in the chat. In the end of my speech, I'm going to prove why parents are principally obliged to save their kids from an anxiety exactly in the period of their childhood, even at the expense of anything else opening government tries to explain. But before that, numerous responses to the OG, and let's start from the futile DPM's attempt to engage with us and rebut the case of my teammate. So he repeats just one thing, healthy communication. But firstly, what is the analysis of that? They have huge gap in that, explaining why this communication is going to be healthy, because motion just assumes that parents are going to tell the full truth, but not about the way how they're gonna do that. And we think that majority of our populations are parents, and we can assume that majority of people have health communication, because perhaps their parents themselves. So secondly, they're not educated in the emotional intelligence. Majority of people just works as employees and don't read some books on emotional intelligence. They don't develop in that particular area. Thirdly, these personal disasters themselves are causing moral harm to that, and it's too hard to be rational and have healthy communication when you tell about these issues. When you was fired, you blame all the world, you start to scream, and it's very hard to have this healthy communications itself. But secondly, even if communication is going to be, and it's a huge point from Audrey position, note that a huge part of this personal disasters is based on the quarrels between two parents, and every parent is going to deliver the truth based on its own connotation of this truth. For example, why we were divorced? So husband is going to tell, so she just destroyed my mental health, putting me into depression. But woman, from her perspective, is going to say he was cheating on me, he was very abusive husband, and you are even more anxious about it. You don't, okay, both of them have health communication with you, but they don't have a healthy communication between themselves. For example, parent who tells that my boss fired me because he's an asshole, but a woman tells that he's too lazy man, that's why I have to work on two or three jobs just because my husband is too lazy. Yes, and you are too confused because you don't know what is the truth to believe in, and open government assumes that only one truth exists, but we have different parents, different relatives who deliver a truth from their point of view. And even in the best case scenario, if they're going to have the healthy communication, I'm in constant anxiety because I have to take the standpoint of each of one parent. But on the other side, on the comparative, firstly, I have to restrain myself from delivering any truth, and it prevents and if we have no communication to that at all, we for sure will not have unhealthy communication. And secondly, we preempt this clash of several truths. It means kids is not confused or parents he should choose, and he can share the happiness of childish life being with both parents. But what about prime minister? So a huge assumption the kids for sure will know the truth. Firstly, it's based on the suitable example. So example, if the person died, he's absent. But yes, on our side of the house, we don't reject it reality at all. But we have the difference in the way how we deliver the truth. Yeah. For example, on our side of the house, you can say that your grandfather decided to observe you from the sky. He decided that he is happy at the sky. He watches you. He's happy, and he thinks, oh, my grandfather is happy. It's so cool. But on the side of the government, you have to say that his body is getting rotten in the soil. We don't know whether any form of spiritual life exists or not. So you will not see. He will not see you ever again. So, and for sure, it will provoke impacts. Borys is talking about you. It will provoke radical anxiety. You don't know how to do that. You don't know how to cope with that. But secondly, we think majority of these personal disasters, it's easy to hide the truth. For example, you can't explicitly detect the cheating as a kid, the depression of your father, or when your father is died. They assume your parents are going to be angry with that. But the virtue of the motion being said, they are not going to be angry. They are to hide that. They still play with their kids as it was before, and when they see their kids by virtue of the emotion, they just hide this emotion. They are not angry. You don't have the fear to say that. Any POI from the CG?
All right. So do you think my lawyer can take decisions independently without asking me because he thinks is the best thing for me?
Yes, we think so. Just because you don't know what is the best for you yet, and this is our principal justification. Because parents are extremely responsible for your anxiety in the childish year age, because only them have agency about that. But you have agency about your own anxiety firstly when you have explored the world exactly, and it is our alternative, because we don't get why it's so important to explore the thing in the childish age when you haven't watched enough movie, when you haven't met enough people and know that people can cheat on each other, that world is not so kind to you, and in the old age you're going to be prepared enough. But secondly, you have a lot of influences apart from your parents. You have met other people, your friends, some teachers, etc., etc. But in this age, only your parents are responsible for your happiness. You can't be responsible for themselves because you don't have any instruments for that, which called an experience of life. Yes, and it's analogous to the resources, for example. Yes, because parents are responsible to provide their kids with satisfaction of their basic needs. Kids are not responsible for that just because they are not able to find money for themselves. But when you get this agency, when you are old enough, you still are going to understand what divorce means, what cheating means, and you go and perceive it well, because you have you know that from your school, you know that from movies you have watched, and you're going to perceive that quite well, and know that it's so they haven't proven why the uniqueness of this period, that you should know that exactly in the childish year when you're likely to play with cats, etc., etc. And it's one more explanation why this hardship of life will be unnoticeable for you, because first you're concentrated on your toys, on your cats, on your school, and not on the emotion of your parents. But secondly, you don't have the instrument to detect the disasters. Just because you're not so emotionally intelligent, you can't build some logic chains. Oh, my father angry and he has sold his car, means he was fired and he had a deficiency in his pocket. So by means of that, firstly, we guaranteed get the happy childish life. It's something which irreversible and uniquely belongs to our side. But secondly, you remember the Borys impact on long term, that your role models and perception of reality are based in your childish year. It means if you if it's going to be fucked up by these personal disasters, you will be unhappy throughout all your life. Thank you. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the DLO for fine speech. Would like to welcome the member of government.
Right, can you see and hear me?
Yes, all good.
All right. Personal pronouns here, they, POI, most likely in the 5th minute. You can ask via voice, just softly say POI. You don't need to distract me. Most likely I'll be taking OO to give a chance for the diagonal engagement. All right. I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. What my speech is going to focus on is what largely has been missing from opening government or from the opening debate in itself. Because for you to be able to say that this eventually has an impact on the children, so it must be respected, there needs to be a principle, or there needs to be a stronger justification for why that has to be so. What OG relies on is the intuition for you that parents always need to always take care of their children. But when we talk about parents over here, it's not just restricted to biological parents. This could be legal guardians in any other way. And therefore there needs to be like pointing out of that specific principle which obligates them to be able to do this in most of those instances. I also tell you why specifically sharing full details is able to justify that principle. But before we go on, like a couple of responses to OO. Like, I don't get what OO is trying to say, because I think OO assumes that once you grow up, you are able to deal with the trauma somehow. They do forget that some of these instances which you talk about impact you in the long term. So for example, bankruptcy is likely to affect the child in the sense of where he now attends school and in terms of the lifestyle changes, which are likely to affect them for a long while. Two, they are also visible to the child. It means that they can be able to see and experience these things. And my extension will show you why they have alternative explanations, which can be far more harmful to their health. So you don't grow up and get better. And this is coming from someone who saw his parents fight all of the time. This trauma haunts you, and this trauma becomes way harder to be able to deal with. In the worst case, on our side, even if you face trauma now, we are much more likely to be able to deal with it, control the narrative on our side than on the other side, right? Let's move on. The principled obligation of parents to act or remain as good agents of children. I've already told you why parents should care, that all of OG's arguments rest on why parents should care about children. OG encourages you to assume our principled MEC is a prerequisite for this to be a claim. That is why we can arrest parents if we see that they have been starving their kids whilst they had money or whilst they just fed themselves or just proving that they had capacity to do so and did not do it, right? Or we force parents to give like child support even when they divorce their parents. The mechanism here is that parents act as agents for the principal, which is mostly the child. This influences the interaction with the state, who actually gives the parents that duty or that responsibility and gives more moral and legal status to the child. How is this expressed? So you see the state subsidizing childcare in heavy areas by making sure that education is really cheap and parents do not have to bear the full brunt in itself. Two, they provide tax relief for parents, that if you're a parent, you pay little tax than the rest of society. But thirdly, society gives you respect and privileges as parents. So you are trusted with more responsibility, for example, and the state recognizes that agency. That requires you to do three things. First of all, establish a duty of care to the child. Two, a duty to act in good faith towards the child. And lastly, a duty of obedience. And that is why when your funds are being managed by a fund manager, he cannot unilaterally take interest or enter into risk or positions just because he thinks it will be good for you without seeking your consent. He cannot then also be like when the market impacts certain things, he cannot say that he's going to hide that information from you. Regardless of the outcome, it is important that he gives you that information. This in itself stretches out opening opposition, because even if we do agree that all of their impacts come to pass, it is not something that we then need to respect in most of those instances. A director cannot take a decision unilaterally on behalf of shareholders. How does this principle play out? But before that, opening opposition.
Your principle is still based on practicalities, and we have explained why children are deeply harmed in short term and long term, and our principle is not based on practicalities in the long run, because parents are not responsible for that long run.
Yeah, well, I know that's why, because mostly principles don't work in debates because people don't prove like the second part of it. And that's why I'm going to the second part. Why does telling or sharing the full circumstances fulfill the obligation of a fiduciary? I'm going to analyze two impacts. First off, the present impact. First, you need to understand this caveat or this frame takes out most of the opening material, because these kids are going to find out anyway under what circumstances. I think they took it from my POI and they just mentioned it, but it's mechanized in three ways. First off, they are likely to find it from the media, which then means that if the media announces that people are losing their jobs, parents are losing their jobs, or whether you were caught in prison and it's shown on the media, they are likely to report this. Two, they're likely to hear it from the neighborhood, from school, from friends, from other people who are gossips and will likely tell them. Three, they can see with their eyes and can guess the circumstances. There's this joke my friend makes about not Googling your symptoms, right? Because most likely what you do is you find them in far more sensationalized forms, people who are willing, who don't have the full information, but tell them in ways in which it becomes very, very harmful to the child. We think when you tell the kids, you are able to condition them and to be able to deal with the recoil effects which most likely would come. That means that on our side, we are better able to deal with mental health issues. Two, it is far more appropriate for you to tell them because you know your child, you know the personality that they have, you know the behavior that they exhibit, so you are far more likely to be able to position them in a way in which they're able to receive this information even much better. You don't get that exclusively on their side. Two, the future impact. One is the child's reaction. We think that the fact that you grew up doesn't mean this goes away. We think kids in this instance are better able to adjust their lifestyle to be able to deal with this. So this does not necessarily put an obligation on the kids, but then they do know that I do not need to like do certain things anymore. I need to change, and they are better able to understand these moments of change. Even if it is negative, you can begin to deal with it in a stage where you can solve it. We think the irreversibility or the difficulty in dealing with trauma already puts us way ahead of the opposition side because we have the ability to be able to impact it. But secondly, the parents' reaction, the ability to create mitigating strategies is impacted negatively if they continue to deny the reality. So if they continually tell themselves that I'm not going to tell my child, I'm going to pretend everything is fine, it affects the ability to be able to deal with this in the long run. But lastly, in the comparative, parents are forced to prioritize themselves, which violates the fiduciary. It means that they care about how they look before the child or care about their emotional response. That's why they'll eat chips and be drinking all day instead of most likely telling the child or thinking about what happens to the child. If we want to be able to protect the child and force them to be reflective of those actions, then we need to be able to ensure that they have a moral duty or they actually tell the kids. Thank you very much.
I thank the member of God for a fan speech. I would like to welcome the member of opposition.
Can you hear me? If you guys want to record. Well, 3, 2, 1. The problem with the closing government principle is twofold. The first thing to note is that I just think that in the vast majority of instances, children cannot consent to the majority of decisions that their parents make. That is to say, we already provide them the ability to make things like medical decisions or decide when you're going to go to a trip or do other stuff. This means we uniquely rely in society on parents actively being good guardians for their children on either side of the house. The question of consent, therefore, doesn't play into the debate insofar as you're under 18, because we often trust parents to have the best interests of their children at heart. The intuitive example for this is just that even if your child doesn't want to take an injection, you probably still inject them with the vaccine because you recognize that this is probably good for them. This then means that the entirety of the closing government principle is hung on the practical impact of, hey, kids are going to find out in the future. And insofar as our extension proves that you're not going to find out, or that even if you do find out, you're able to cope with this better, I think we're already beating closing government in their absolute best case. First piece of extension and framing then. I want to first be very clear on what the comparative in this debate is, because it's probably true that it's probably true that you're still going to be expressing the vast majority of circumstances. That is to say that you're probably going to be talking to your child about, hey guys, we're probably not going to see your mom as much anymore because there's some stuff that's going on within our lives. It often does look like saying we're probably not going to be engaging in the same amount, and therefore you're often able to provide things like adequate explanations. Why are these explanations largely sufficient? Firstly, it's often easier for children to internalize. That is to say that being able to digest information in tidbits is often quite simple for children, and therefore it's relatively easier. But second, children are often quite young and therefore not processing and are able to absorb large amounts of information. This then uniquely means they were able to actively convey the most important parts of this information significantly better, and therefore it's quite likely that children are going to be learning about this significantly better. But lastly, I think you can derive core lessons in particularly important ways. What does this look like? It looks like actively saying, hey guys, your granddad might be dead, your grandma might be dead, but she's with God on the comparative, versus saying, yeah, she's rotting in the soil on our side of the house. What this means on the comparative then is that you're often able to convert your child significantly more because you don't necessarily have to engage by telling them, hey guys, you're actively messed up. Two things then that I want to talk about. Firstly, why are we much more likely to actively harm children on side government? And here's where a lot of framing comes in, because opening opposition basically says, hey guys, things are black and white and children don't have a prefrontal developed cortex. This isn't really mechanization for the actual impacts in three key ways. First, I think it relies on biological assertions and not actual structural warranting. But second, I think it's often just under-mechanized. That is, it's unclear to me why children aren't moral actors and can't perceive things. This is where we're going to add significantly on why this is likely to tilt your views in particular ways. 4 particular ways this happens. Firstly, I just think children are likely to internalize things quite significantly terribly. Why is this particularly true? 1, children are often quite irrational. They're relatively young and therefore often know that things like life experiences and are unlikely to be able to process the vast majority of information. Second, they're quite immature and often don't possess the knowledgeables of lived reality the opening government wants to assume. That is to say that in the vast majority of instances, children haven't dealt with things like grief, they haven't dealt with things like emotional trauma, and are therefore quite unprepared for the kinds of harms that exist. What does this then mean for the debate. The first thing this means that in the vast majority of instances, when you're actively exposed to a massive amount of information about what exactly happens, here's how children are likely to react. One, I think they often internalize this. They often are unable to internalize this in a positive way. They often blame themselves and often are likely to feel quite scared and terrified. What does this then look like? It means three particular things. One, it often means you feel significantly more unstable as a child. Your literal foundations, the fact that your parents love you and now you're told, hey guys, your mom is leaving, means that you literally feel significantly more shitty about yourself. You're like, hey, maybe they left because they didn't love me. Maybe this is going on. What in the world is wrong? And this causes significant amounts of instability in your actual life. Second, I think it often means that you feel significantly more unhappy. Look, when you're told the full gravity of the situation, you're unable to fully grasp it because you're unable to understand the full logical reasoning of either parent or either of what actually happened because you probably do not possess the cognitive ability to do so. You probably are unable to truly understand what your parents are actively talking about. What does this then mean? It means you're often likely to feel much worse on the comparative at the point where you're likely to be like, hey, I can't really understand what's going on, but significant shit happening. It means you're unable to actively internalize the vast majority of this. But third, I think you feel much worse on their side of the house, right? Because even if it's true that on the comparative, there's some degree of like being able to talk to our parents and stuff, I think these conversations often go significantly worse. Why is this actively true? Firstly, because parents are often quite emotional in the vast majority of instances. More crucially, this is a potential disaster, and therefore it's quite likely to be the case that the way this is talked about is with raw emotion and often quite subjective from a parent's perspective. This then means parents are often unprepared for the kinds of conversations that closing government wants to talk about. What does this then mean, and how does this take out the best majority of their principle? Note crucially that if it's true that the media and other things are biased, it's quite likely that parents are significantly more biased in these scenarios. What does this look like? It looks like when my parents are going to talk to me about my grandma's death, and they say, hey, your grandma died in a car accident, they're likely to be crying, they're likely to be quite significantly worse off. What does this then mean? It means on the comparative, you're much more likely to feel actively harmed, and therefore your child doesn't want to actively trust you. What does this then mean for the debate? Very simple weighing here, two pieces. First, I think on the comparative, it's much more likely that the child feels significantly more unstable. They do not know what is right and wrong, and they do not know how to actively feel about particular scenarios. But second, when the full gravity of a massive situation is brought down upon a child who literally is unable to internalize stuff because they're probably 6 or 7 and probably doesn't understand how the world actually works, means that you're likely to feel really, really bad as a child. This breaks you as a child, and it's unlikely to actively be conducive because in the most instances. Then I just want to be finishing up the debate then with like going significantly beyond opening opposition, because I think they're quite uncharitable in their engagement with government, who probably proves to some extent that you can learn about this from society. I'm going to prove why parents are likely to not be as likely to be able to hide stuff and often mitigate the harms to children. But before that, opening, go for it.
Showing emotional vulnerability as a parent is a good thing. It, on the one hand, validates the feelings of the child themselves, plus it shows that the parents are not unemotional, just golems, I don't know.
That's not what we said. You can show emotional vulnerability while talking about your grandma's death, but you don't have to fucking talk about the fact that they died in a car accident and literally got squished and stuff. Like things like that are probably not things that we're going to be discussing. Why then are you able to hide stuff and are actively able to be strong for your child? 3 ways. One, I think often these situations are largely personal. That is to say, the closing government's entire case is reliant on the idea of, hey guys, my dad was a gangster, or that there's a big divorce happening. Often these situations are quite personal and therefore unlikely to be massively publicized in media. Secondly, I think parents are often able to act quite strong for their children, i.e. it's probably true that as a parent you care quite a bit about your child and are therefore unlikely to be like, hey, X, Y, and Z, I'm going to continue snapping at you in the vast majority of instances. There's probably significant incentives to want to care about your child on either side of the house, and therefore it's quite likely they're able to actively act strong. And so far as you don't actively talk about these kinds of things with your children, it's quite likely then there's a much larger incentive to continue acting like you're actively stable. But third, I think it means that you're often able to teach your child a better coping strategy and actively provide them a more stable and happy life. This means on the comparative, you're not actively snapping or actively dampening or depressing all the time. This means on the comparative, you're able to hide these emotions and are often able to provide the child a much more secure base for actually growing. This then means you're likely to be able to hide these kinds of things and are often able to mitigate the worst off of these extents. This goes beyond opening opposition, who just asserts, aha, maybe you're going to learn about all of this. Very proud to oppose.
I think the member of Op for Fine Speech would like to welcome the government whip.
Am I audible?
Yes, sure.
Awesome. Just give me a sec to arrange my sheets. Great. I'm going to take POIs via voice, but most likely I'll personally accept one from OO around my 5th minute, so you can just wait and then I'll accept you also. All right. I'm going to begin. By the way, before I begin my speech, I'll say shout out to Erasmus. He's been a great partner so far, and I hope this goes well. Okay, I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Bankruptcy is not easy to recover from. Very few parents are likely to recover from it. In most circumstances, these situations make you plunge into long and hard years of economic struggle and poverty. Your lifestyle as a family changes. Where you stay changes because you can no more afford mortgages in those communities. You lose your businesses and assets and can't keep up with the school fees of the current standard of school that your child attends, and would have to change their school to less quality schools like community-based schools. By doing that, you pull them away from their friends in school. You pull them away from their social circles. You would have to move to new and lower income communities where you can afford things and where you can afford cheap accommodation. You would change your diets as a family, and which would probably give them some health reactions initially, right? Until they adapt, and you put them away from their friends, loved ones, social circles, etc. Given that you change their schools, neighborhoods, and all the other things, they no more enjoy things like the Friday chess club meetings that they used to attend. They no more enjoy things like the book and the reading club meetings that they used to attend, which means this becomes normalized eventually in their lives. The claim from up to assume that this is some 2 months shabby experience that you go back to, and eventually when it's all past and said and done, there is nothing that you would remember, and even when you hear about it, already things have returned back to normal, is extremely unrealistic. This is not a few things changing. This is a drastic reorientation of the child's identity and their existentiality in so much ways that they have to become different people, different versions of the children they used to be in order to survive and keep up with the drastic changes that happen in their parents' lives. What this means is that without an understanding, this becomes a ridiculously difficult emotional roller coaster that has the ability to damage them mentally for life. What this does is 2 things. A, it strengthens Erasmus's moral obligation, because this is not a simple negative circumstance. There are circumstances that can actively reorient the identities of the children. And at least you owe them that obligation to inform them of circumstances and the likely outcomes that are going to happen. But then CEO's response is to say, well, it's because the child can't make decisions on their own, and they've ceded that consent to parents. I posit that in instances of identity, increasingly, children are being informed and are being given the room to consent to most of these things. What it means is that you have more agency and more legitimacy as a parent when your children understand what is going on and the likely circumstances to come out of it, to take the best decisions within those circumstances to be able to avoid the most catastrophic incomes. Secondly, we're able to create a better transition for those children into those new identities because they are mentally prepared and understand that these are the series of events that are likely to happen, because bankruptcy is a serious issue and not being broke for 1 month or 2 months, right? What it means is that the transition into those new identities is much more smooth on our side. On their side, the children undergo these drastic changes and are confused as to why this is happening. And this is why UP cannot win, because this change is usually so drastic that half-baked explanations that OO and CEO says we should give, which would likely look like, oh, my salary didn't come in this month and that's why I couldn't afford these things for you, would not explain you having to move to poor communities, changing their schools from the top-notch schools that they used to attend to community-based schools where they no more have their friends, they no more have the standard of teaching and the technology and the nice things that they are used to. You cannot expect them to understand this drastic scope of change with half-baked responses, which means you still plunge them into mistrust with their parents because they can easily identify that parents are lying. Secondly, this may also mean like the death of close relatives that may plunge you into very strong emotional state, assuming your sister dies, that you are very close with them and may make you take therapy, etc. It lets the child understand that you, the parents, are not your ideal self that they used to know. And so certain things they have to compromise on. That means that they are most likely not going to blame themselves. OT touches on this, but doesn't show the impact of kids blaming themselves. For instance, they socially withdraw. They perform poorly in schools because the home is depressing and they constantly think about what is going on. Imagine this is happening to a child who is supposed to be writing their SAT within that period. Their education and their learning ability plummets, and it makes them fail that SAT exams, sets their entire life back by a year. These are circumstances that will probably make them miss crucial opportunity timelines in the future for their career, etc. You can never extend or you can never cap the scope to which this can affect the lives and livelihood of children. And so you cannot gamble and say we shouldn't tell them. They need to be able to do this. Opening opposition.
It seems both government teams have problems with understanding its emotions. So obviously, the more dramatic the practical change, the more detailed explanation we provide to it. The question is whether the explanation is traumatic or whether we try to at least somewhat shield the children and allow them to cope with it.
No. Because the reality is that once you tell the child it's bankruptcy, you need to tell the child what is likely to follow. And the reality is that what is likely to follow is as horrific as what I described, which means they are still going to experience those horrific consequences. But on your side, you don't tell them and they don't prepare for it. And you assume that they would be okay, which is unrealistic. Unless you're able to show that by not telling them, you make them not go through those consequences. You cannot win because they would still face the dire harsh consequences of these things. But secondly, what this means is that these things harm the children even beyond years of parental control. And this takes away the claims from all. But secondly, it's way bigger impact of harm beyond the current and that affects the current mental state of the child due to active depression, etc. The second thing Erasmus tells you about is that they will find out either ways, and that's in more damaging ways. CEO says, well, these are personal issues. I'll tell you, children ears drop on parents' conversations when they hear parents are quarreling. Sometimes they're in their rooms, they hear some of these things because you are shouting on top of their voice. What it means is that on our side, you have, on their side, they usually don't hear the full story. They hear skewed versions. They hear versions that may not represent exactly what is going on. And they tend to misinterpret these things and react wrongly. On our side, what we do is that we're able to control the circumstances under which they receive this information. But more importantly, parents are there on our side at the time when they're receiving this information to control or help them navigate their emotional reactions. On your side, children, for example, who are mentally volatile would likely attempt suicide because when they hear their parents arguing about the divorce, they think it is because of them that their parents are divorcing and they want to take away their life so their parents can be together, etc. They likely have worse emotional reactions, which will likely lead to bodily harm. On our side, parents are there to guide you, help you soak this in, and this is better. There are two things I prove. You cannot drastically reorient a child's identity without having them foreknowledge and helping them transition. But secondly, bodily harm for these children is far more likely on these guys' side. We've never been this proud to defend the integrity of parents.
I think we go for a fan speech. We'd like to welcome the opposition.
Just double checking, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, give me one quick second, sorry. I like my BOI in chat, but I'll probably ask for one, preferably for an opening. Three, two, one, start. I'll start on my speech and looking at the framing of this debate, right? I think what you need to first recognize is what is full circumstances, right? And then we'll move on to opening government 001 CG, right? I think let's first just look at the framing of this debate and what we actually brought up in closing where none of the House actually engaged with, right? Full circumstances meaning it's not the same as, hey, your mom wouldn't be around anymore. It's literally sitting your children down and explaining the situation in a lot of details, right? I think that's why largely the opening edits of the debate, the minute they don't characterize the debate proper, right? This isn't just telling your children that your parent passed away, but rather the actual detail. That means, example, if your parent today die of a traumatic death, you will know as a children, right? And therefore, on a comparative, that is, for example, like instead of telling people that your grandma is with God, you tell them, oh, your grandma actually passed away from cancer, right? I think that what you need to understand, crucially, what we tell you in closing composition is that we detail these circumstances as time goes on, right? Because I think government and underside government, they have to defend that you tell children in the minute that the disaster happens, right? Therefore, on side opposition, you can actually ease the children on it, and therefore that's why it's better off, right? Because we can appropriate time when emotions aren't raw, and therefore on the impact of this is that children are more likely to internalize these emotions better off and probably more positive, right? I think what you also need to recognize is what Muzzi tell you, right? 4 things then. Firstly, you need to recognize is that children, parents are oftentimes also going to be hit by this traumatic event, right? This isn't just a one-way conversation from children, but also from the from the parents, right? Therefore, you cannot handle coming off of your children. Secondly, what you need to recognize is that parents are oftentimes not objective, right? They're oftentimes going to have emotions tied to it, right? Thirdly, what you need to recognize is that your parents are more likely to toss emotion onto the children. The impact of this is that you're likely to have worsened relationship. I think this is where we stand out at the top of the debate, right? I think then just moving on to house by house comparison, right? Firstly, on open government, 4 main points, right? I think firstly, they tell us, we will know about things such as death eventually, and but they at the same time they tell us that you'll know the full detail, right? I think opening government is largely uncomparative, and they need to engage with the entirety of the debate, right? This debate isn't just about bankruptcy and divorce; it's also about death, but also the full detail of the death. And therefore, I think the minute the opening government doesn't defend their full burden, they're out of the debate, right? Regardless, let's deal with what they actually tell us, right? Firstly, they tell us children are sensitive. Exactly because children are sensitive, I think they're more likely to internalize the information. They're more likely to blame themselves, right? I think the minute that you recognize children are sensitive, I think that's the minute that you don't tell the children information because you don't know how they're likely to actually handle this information, right? I think thirdly, what they tell us is transparency, right? We argue that yes, even if transparency is good, you need to recognize this debate is a full circumstance. Therefore, transparency in this time is harmful, right? Transparency isn't always helpful the minute that actually harms you actively, and that's why transparency can't be something that open government wants to claim, right? I think lastly, what they tell us is that this actually improves other relationship with children because they're more likely to openly talk about things, right? I think opening government probably forgot how they were when they were children. What you need to understand is children are pretty much they're pretty much uncivil, right? If you look at how children actually bully each other, they oftentimes attack the familial relationship of other children, right? Therefore, these interpersonal relationships are going to be worse off on opening government because children don't know how to actually handle these traumatic events, right? I think then just moving on to the deadlock that happened in opening, right? There is this deadlock on who it's likely to shift the blame to. Is it likely to shift to the parent or shift to the children, right? I think what you need to understand is that it's more likely children or parents are more likely to be angry at each other on side government because it's going to be a tense situation, and therefore you're likely to toss emotions around, right? Therefore, on government, on the opening, what we tell you that the result of that deadlock is that actually overall on side government, it's going to be worse off because you actually cannot maturely handle emotions regardless of the position you're in. But before that opening government.
Okay, so we told you that on both sides of the house, parents have a vested incentive to not scar their kids. So they're probably not going to give them super gory details, but what you're doing is you're actively lying to them. We're not scarring them, you're lying to them.
Look, you need to engage with what Muzzi said and also what my opening say, right? You're still allowed to tell your children that your family's members are no longer there, but instead on government side, what you need to defend is the full details. That's the wording of the motion. I think you have yet to fulfill that burden, right? The minute that you don't tell us what those full details are, you fail out of this debate, right? So even if you don't tell the exact details, you probably need to tell your children why your mother left you, right? Your mother left you because I don't know, your mother was having an affair, etc. Right? I think that's pretty detrimental to the children, regardless of the actual details that goes into things, right? I think then just moving on to what our closing say, right? 3 main things then. I think firstly, just the principle of parents and how you know your children are the best, right? I think what you need to recognize is that parents also have the principal duty to protect your children from harm, right? I think the minute that you expose your children to these things, you're probably exposing them to harm, right? Also, they give us this really weird parallelism about lawyers and their client, right? You as a client, you're an adult, you can make a legal decision. You actually have the agency to make the children, but you need to engage with the Muzzi's analysis that you have a children, you don't have the agency to make the decision, and therefore that's why your principle falls, right? Also, you don't need to tell us then, for example, then they went on and tell us children can make decisions. Yeah, children make decision on what color of crayons they want to use, not on what vaccines they want to do. And this is exactly the scenarios, right? They're facing a situation that's probably going to be life-changing. And I don't think children are situated to actually know about things, right? I think secondly, what they tell us is about media, right? What you need to recognize is that it's just not the majority of cases, right? In the majority of instances, when someone in your family passes, it's unlikely to get into the media, right? I don't think the delta in this debate is whether or not you find out in the information, but whether or not you should tell your children, right? And I think in these instances, you shouldn't, right? I think lastly, what they actually added when what just this idea that it's a crucial situation for children, and what if they're studying the SAT, right? I think this isn't just what the debate is about, right? If your children is studying for SAT, I don't think you should tell your children like the actual gruesome details of why your parents left or why like your parents have a divorce, right? Therefore, I think it's actually worse off on side government. I think then just lastly, looking at our opening, right? 3 main points. So firstly, an important phase, like this is an important phase of children growing up. Yes, we agree it's an important phase, but I think you need to take in what Muzzi told you, right? Muzzi tell you that children are more likely to internalize and be irrational and be immature during this time, during their when they're growing up, right? So we actually added additional mechanism by telling you why children are likely to be worse off instead of just making claims that children are not going to be developed, right? Secondly, to tell you it's easy to hide the truth, right? I think this is a deadlock with closing government with too, like, or whether or not truth are likely to be found out, right? I think if you want to hide the truth, there is a way you can hide the truth. I don't think this is where the debate actually lies, right? I think lastly, just on anxiety and negative emotions, right? I just want to emphasize what Muzzi told you, right? We tell you, yes, anxiety and negative emotions are likely to exist, but what we added onto you is we analyze how these situations look like and why these situations are harmful for children. And so therefore, on side opposition, we want to protect children, proud to oppose.
I thank the OpWeb for a fun speech and all the speakers for a great debate. I assume that we can stay here as judges and judge in the breakout room. Yeah. Okay. Then the recording can stop.